There is a set of instructions running in your financial life right now that you did not write. You did not choose them. You were never handed a document explaining what they were, where they came from, or why you received them. But they are running. They have been running since before you were old enough to understand what money was, and they are shaping, with more influence than your income, more influence than your education, more influence than any financial advice you have ever received, or any strategy you have ever learned. The financial decisions you make every single day, these instructions were written by people who are mostly dead. They were written in one of the most traumatic economic periods in recorded human history, a period of such sustained, widespread, and catastrophic scarcity that it permanently altered the psychology of everyone who lived through it. And then, through the most intimate and powerful transmission mechanism in human experience, the family, it passed those alterations forward into the children and the grandchildren, and in many cases the great-grandchildren, of the people who survived it. The instructions were written by the Great Depression, and if your family has any connection, however distant or however diluted by time, to people who lived through that era, there is a significant probability that some version of those instructions is still running in you, quietly, automatically, without your awareness or your consent. And in a financial environment that is almost entirely unlike the one those instructions were designed for, some of them are helping you, and some of them are costing you in ways you have never fully measured. I want to measure them today, not to dismiss the people who form these habits, because those people deserve nothing but respect. They survived something genuinely terrible. The habits they developed in response to that survival were rational, adaptive, and appropriate to their circumstances. They kept families alive. They built a generation that came out of catastrophe with a degree of resilience and resourcefulness that the modern world has largely lost. These habits worked, for their time, for their context. For a world organized around specific conditions of scarcity, institutional unreliability, and economic uncertainty that no longer exist in the same form. And some of those habits, translated across time and context, are as valuable now as they ever were, but some of them are not. I'm not forcing to tell a keve something effect in the called public deepery. But Holly Kirk or not, what pissen pretty this TV, what one firk sutu for, and what your tour to that amarbit what if you can che, what in the ifs of the elpapam behavior, the shay hibelachol did that part ups for two, what a bitch what if you can provide, some sort to were not tall compelling to old the mentendale. Some of them are doing damage in a world they were never designed for, imposing a Depression-era cost structure on a life being lived in a completely different economic reality. And the damage done by a habit running in the wrong environment can be significant, invisible, and entirely resistant to correction, as long as the habit is invisible and its origins are misunderstood. What makes this particularly difficult to address is that Depression-era habits do not feel like inherited fear. They feel like common sense. They feel like wisdom. They feel like the obvious and correct response to a world that is uncertain, because the world is uncertain. And when a habit feels like common sense, it does not get examined, it gets honored. It gets repeated. Folly, it gets passed to the next generation with the same implicit message that all inherited wisdom carries, which is that this is how people like us handle things. And people like us handle things this way for good reason. The good reason was real once. But the examination of whether it remains good, in these circumstances, in this economy, with these tools, and these protections and these possibilities that did not exist in 1933, that examination almost never happens. Because common sense does not invite examination. It invites compliance, and compliance with a habit that was formed in the Depression, applied to a life being lived in a fundamentally different economic moment, is the quiet engine of a set of financial costs that most people carry for their entire lives without ever understanding their origin. So let us look at them, one by one, with the respect they deserve for what they once were, and the honesty they require about what some of them have become. The first habit is the hoarding of cash. The instinct to keep money in the most immediately accessible, physically present, and institutionally independent form possible. For the generation that lived through the Depression, this was not irrational. Banks failed. One morning you had savings. The next morning the bank did not open and you had nothing. Across the early 1930s, thousands of American banks failed, wiping out the savings of millions of ordinary families who had done nothing wrong except trust an institution that proved structurally incapable of surviving the economic collapse it was embedded in. The lived experience of institutional failure at this scale, repeated enough times in enough communities, burned into the psyche of an entire generation, the conviction that the only money you could trust was money you could touch, money under the mattress, money in a coffee can buried in the backyard, Money held physically because the institutions designed to hold it had proven catastrophically unreliable. That conviction, in 1933, was evidence-based and appropriate. That conviction, carried forward into the present, is costing you money every single year in a way that is quiet, consistent, and almost impossible to see unless you look directly at it. Because cash held outside of productive investment, cash sitting in a low-yield savings account, or, in the most extreme version of the Depression-era inheritance, actually kept at home in a place considered safer than a bank, is not safe in the way the person holding it believes it to be safe. It is losing value, slowly, every year, at the rate of inflation, which runs between 2 and 4% in normal economic conditions, and has run considerably higher in recent years. A dollar held in cash for 20 years at 3% average annual inflation is worth roughly 55 cents of its original purchasing power at the end of those 20 years. The dollar is still there, the number has not changed. But the power of the dollar, what it can actually buy in the real world, has been cut nearly in half by the simple passage of time and the persistent erosion of inflation. This is not a theoretical loss, it is a real and measurable reduction in what that money can actually do in the world. Consider what this means in practice. A family that holds $50,000 in cash equivalents, beyond a reasonable emergency fund, for 20 years as an expression of the Depression-era security instinct, does not just miss the investment returns those $50,000 could have generated. They lose more than $20,000 of purchasing power to inflation, while simultaneously foregoing the compounding that would have grown the original sum into something substantially larger. The combined cost of the habit, over 20 years, on $50,000, is the difference between having $50,000 of diminished purchasing power and having something approaching $300,000 of compounding returns at a moderate 7% annual return. That is the price of the inherited safety instinct applied in the wrong environment. Not a small price, a life-altering one. The banks are insured now. The regulatory framework that emerged in direct response to the Depression-era banking failures has made the scenario of a solitary depositor losing all of their money in a bank failure almost entirely obsolete for balances within insurance limits. The FDIC, created specifically because of what happened to ordinary depositors in the Depression, guarantees deposits up to $250,000 per depositor per institution. The institutional reliability that the Depression generation could not count on is, for most people in most circumstances, a structural feature of the modern banking system, rather than an individual gamble. The fear that generated the cash hoarding habit was appropriate to a world without deposit insurance. It is substantially less appropriate to a world with it, and the cost of not updating the habit to reflect the changed world is the inflation penalty paid every year on money that could have been compounding instead of eroding. The second habit is the aversion to any form of debt, regardless of context or terms. The Depression generation had a relationship with debt that was, again, entirely rational, given what they had experienced. Debt, in the Depression, was often the mechanism through which people lost everything. The farm that could not service its loan when crop prices collapsed. The house that was foreclosed on when the income that was supposed to repay the mortgage disappeared overnight. The business that was shuttered when the line of credit was called in at the worst possible moment. Debt was not an abstraction or a financial tool with variable properties depending on its purpose and its cost. Debt was the thing that could take everything, the instrument through which catastrophe completed itself. And so the lesson transmitted across generations was simple and absolute. Debt is dangerous. Avoid it. Pay it off as fast as possible. Never owe anyone anything, if you can possibly help it. Sleep easier when you owe nothing. Fear the moment when someone can take what you built because you owe them for it. This lesson, like the cash hoarding instinct, was earned through genuine suffering and genuine observation of cause and effect. And this lesson, like the cash hoarding instinct, carries within it something genuinely valuable, a skepticism about debt, a reluctance to take on obligations without careful consideration of consequences, that remains relevant and useful. People who carry zero debt absolutism from their Depression-era inheritance do not typically rack up consumer credit card debt at 22% interest. They do not finance depreciating assets with borrowed money they cannot afford to repay. These are genuinely beneficial resistances in a modern consumer economy that actively and aggressively encourages exactly those behaviors. The debt aversion has real protective value in some domains. The problem is the absolutism, the inability, built into the transmission of the lesson across generations, to distinguish between destructive debt and productive debt, between the debt that takes everything and the debt that builds something, between the farm loan that led to foreclosure when the agricultural economy collapsed and the mortgage on a rental property that generates income exceeding its carrying cost, between the credit that trapped families in the Depression and the capital access that funds growth in a functioning economy with established legal protections, regulatory frameworks, and insurance mechanisms that simply did not exist in 1933. The inheritance of debt aversion, without the accompanying sophistication to distinguish debt by type, cost, and purpose, produces specific and measurable financial costs. It produces people who pay down low-interest mortgages aggressively, making extra principal payments on a 3% loan while holding no market investments, missing years of compounding at 7 to 10% that would have produced returns far exceeding the interest they were avoiding. The math on this is not subtle. Every dollar applied to a 3% mortgage instead of a 7% investment costs you 4% per year, compounded across however many years the pattern continues. Over a decade on meaningful sums, this is a very large number, and it is a cost that feels like responsibility and discipline and the right thing to do, because it comes from a moral framework that equates debt with danger and debt elimination with security. The framework is not wrong in its values. It is wrong in its application to a world where not all debt is equivalent, and where the opportunity cost of avoiding cheap debt is the foregoing of expensive compounding. The third habit is the one with perhaps the most ambiguous legacy, because it contains within it something so genuinely valuable that condemning it entirely would be both wrong and ungrateful. It is the habit of profound material frugality, the reuse of everything, the refusal to throw away what can be repaired, the buying of only what is necessary, and the consumption of all of what is bought, the saving of bread bags and rubber bands, and the careful washing and reuse of things that the modern world considers disposable. The making do culture that built a generation capable of extraordinary resourcefulness in conditions of genuine scarcity. This habit, in its origin, was a survival mechanism of the highest order. When you do not know if there will be enough, you waste nothing. When every item has a replacement cost that may not be affordable, you maintain every item with the care it deserves. When scarcity is not a theoretical condition but the daily reality of your material life, you develop a relationship with material goods that treats them as precious rather than disposable, because they are precious rather than disposable, because the alternative to preserving them is going without. In the modern context, this habit operates on a spectrum from genuinely beneficial to genuinely costly, and where it lands on that spectrum depends entirely on where it is applied. The anti-consumerist core of the Depression-era frugality, the resistance to buying things you do not need, the recognition that most modern consumption is driven by manufactured desire rather than genuine necessity, the willingness to maintain and repair rather than replace on the first sign of wear, these remain genuinely valuable orientations in a world that is organized, at enormous expense, and with extraordinary psychological sophistication, to make you consume as much as possible, as reflexively as possible. The person who inherited the Depression-era skepticism about unnecessary consumption and applies it to their modern financial life has a real and meaningful advantage over the person whose spending is entirely governed by the consumer economy's manipulation of their desires. But the Depression-era frugality, when inherited without adjustment, also produces a habit of avoiding expenditures that would generate disproportionate returns. The refusal to invest in higher quality tools or infrastructure that would last longer and perform better, because the immediate cost is higher even when the long-term cost is lower, which is the exact error the Vimes Boots theory describes, and which the Depression generation made, not by choice but by necessity. The unwillingness to pay for expertise, for professional advice, for services that would free time currently being spent on low-value activities, because paying someone to do something you could theoretically do yourself feels like waste. The avoidance of experiences and investments in capability and connection that have costs in the present but generate value across years, because the Depression-era calculus was always and entirely about surviving the immediate rather than investing in the eventual. All of these are places where the Depression-era frugality, misapplied to different conditions, quietly costs more than it saves. The fourth habit is the deepest and the most difficult to address directly, because it is not really a habit at all in the observable behavioral sense. It is a felt relationship with scarcity itself. The Depression generation lived in a world where scarcity was not a passing condition or an occasional constraint, but the permanent structure of daily reality, and extended exposure to scarcity as the permanent structure of reality produces a psychological orientation toward the world that is not merely behavioral but perceptual. You do not just behave as if there is not enough. You see the world through a lens that interprets it as a place where there is not enough, where what you have can be taken, where abundance is temporary and suspicious, but where financial security, if it ever arrives, must be hoarded rather than deployed because it might disappear as suddenly and completely as it appeared. This is the scarcity mindset that researchers like Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir documented in their work on the psychology of poverty and want. Their finding, replicated across many contexts, is that the experience of scarcity fundamentally reorganizes cognitive priorities in ways that produce specific and measurable impairments in long-term decision-making. When the mind is consumed by the management of not enough, it borrows cognitive bandwidth from the functions responsible for planning, for considering future consequences, for evaluating options against longer-term goals. The tunnel vision of scarcity is adaptive in the immediate emergency. It focuses your attention on the most pressing problem, but it produces collateral costs in every domain that requires the broader perspective it has borrowed from. The inherited scarcity mindset, the one that arrives not from your own experience of scarcity, but from the deeply absorbed lessons of a family culture shaped by people who did experience it, produces many of these same effects without the actual scarcity that generated them. It produces excessive risk aversion that prevents the deployment of capital in ways that would generate returns, because the perceived danger of loss outweighs the perceived benefit of gain, even when the objective probability favors acting. It produces a preference for certain small gains over uncertain larger ones that consistently leaves value on the table, because the certainty itself is what the scarcity-oriented mind is optimizing for, rather than the expected value of the decision. It produces a chronic low-level financial anxiety that occupies cognitive bandwidth and impairs decision quality, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where the anxiety generated by the scarcity mindset impairs the decisions that would actually reduce legitimate financial insecurity, and it produces something that is perhaps the most costly of all its expressions, and the hardest to see clearly from inside it. It produces the inability to allow yourself to be in a genuinely good financial position without immediately finding a reason to be anxious about losing it. The person carrying a Depression-era scarcity mindset, who achieves genuine financial security, does not typically feel secure. They feel precarious security that could evaporate. They feel the anxiety of having something worth losing, which can be more uncomfortable than the familiarity of having nothing to protect. And in response to that anxiety, they make decisions aimed at restoring the psychological state they are calibrated for, which is the managed scarcity of a world where you never quite have enough, rather than the uncomfortable abundance of a world where you have more than you need, and must decide what to do with it. This is the inherited legacy of Depression-era scarcity, running in people who have never themselves been hungry, who have never experienced the institutional failures that created the original condition, who are living in an economy with more structural protections, more investment vehicles, more pathways to building wealth from ordinary income than any previous generation in history, and it is costing them not in the obvious dramatic ways that catastrophe costs. It is costing them in the quiet, cumulative, decade-by-decade way that invisible costs always accumulate, in the investment not made because it felt too risky, in the opportunity not pursued because the downside felt catastrophic, in the financial life organized entirely around the prevention of loss rather than the production of gain, which was entirely appropriate for 1933, and is genuinely costly in a completely different economic moment. What do you do with all of this? If you recognize yourself in some of these habits, if you hear your grandparents' voices in some of the financial instincts that run your decisions, if you feel the pull of the cash-holding impulse, or the debt aversion, or the scarcity orientation, ways that you have never been able to fully explain with reference to your own experience, because your own experience does not contain the conditions that generated them, what do you actually do? The first thing is the most important, and the simplest to state, even if it is the hardest to execute. You separate the wisdom from the fear, because the Depression-era financial inheritance is not one thing. It is a package, and the package contains both genuine wisdom that deserves to be honored and preserved, and fear-driven responses to conditions that no longer exist in the same form, that deserve to be examined, updated, and in some cases released. The anti-consumerism is wisdom. The absolutist debt aversion is fear. The maintenance and preservation ethic is wisdom. The avoidance of productive investment, because it feels like unnecessary risk, is fear. The skepticism about institutions is wisdom, in appropriate measure. The refusal to use insured banking infrastructure because of Depression-era institutional distrust is fear that is costing you real money in real time. Sorting these requires honesty, and requires the willingness to examine instincts that feel like good sense, but may be responses to a world that no longer exists. The second thing is to update the rules without abandoning the principles. Take the core principle behind each Depression-era habit and ask what that principle looks like applied to the actual conditions of your actual financial life. The principle behind the cash hoarding habit is security, liquidity, the ability to survive a disruption without being destroyed by it, That principle is valid and important and worth maintaining. But the implementation of that principle in the modern world does not require cash under a mattress or in a savings account paying less than inflation. It requires an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses, held in a high-yield savings account that at least reduces the inflation penalty, while deploying the remaining capital into instruments that actually compound. Same principle, different and better implementation for different and better conditions. The principle behind the debt aversion is the recognition that obligations can destroy you if circumstances change. Valid, important, worth maintaining. But the implementation does not require avoiding all debt regardless of its cost or its purpose. It requires evaluating each debt against the return it enables and the risk it carries, and making the distinction that the Depression generation was too traumatized to make with consistency between debt as destruction and debt as tool. A debt whose carrying cost is lower than the return it funds is not the instrument of the Depression, it is a lever. And levers, used correctly, move things that cannot be moved by hand. The third thing is gratitude without inheritance. The Depression generation built something remarkable from almost nothing. They built families, communities, a post-war economy of genuine prosperity through habits of frugality and resilience and resourcefulness that deserve genuine admiration. Honoring what they built does not require continuing every practice they used to build it. The best way to honor the sacrifice of people who survived catastrophic scarcity is not to live as if you are still in it. It is to take the financial foundation they worked to build and extend it forward with the tools, the knowledge, and the conditions that they did not have, to invest the surplus they protected, to deploy the capital they accumulated, to take the safety they fought for, and use it as a launch pad rather than a bunker. That is not disrespect, that is completion. That is the thing they built the safety for, even if they could never fully bring themselves to use it the way the changed world made possible. The habits your grandparents formed were responses to a real world. The world has changed. The habits in some cases have not. And the gap between the world the habits were designed for and the world you are actually living in is where the cost accumulates. Not in any single decision, not in any obvious failure, but in the quiet, consistent, so features, påförd set of one with Hapram Prig. Year-by-year difference between a financial life organized around surviving the Depression and a financial life organized around building something in the conditions that actually exist today. I want to be very specific about what that cost looks like in aggregate, because individual habit costs are easy to minimize when considered in isolation. The cash hoarding habit applied to a $50,000 sum held for 20 years in a low-yield account instead of invested at a moderate market return costs somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 in foregone compounding, depending on the specific return assumptions. The debt aversion habit, applied as aggressive mortgage paydown, instead of parallel investment over 15 years on a similar sum, costs somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 in foregone investment returns. Net flick of the interest avoided, the frugality misapplication, the chronic underinvestment in health, in professional development, in tools and expertise that would compound professionally and financially, is harder to quantify, but is not less real, and the scarcity mindset, applied to a lifetime of financial decisions, produces a trajectory of risk-adjusted choices that consistently underperforms what the same resources, deployed with confidence rather than fear, would have built. These costs are not small, they are not marginal. Summed across a working life, in the financial lives of ordinary people who are otherwise doing many things right, they represent the difference between a comfortable retirement and a financially precarious one, between leaving something behind and leaving nothing, between the security the Depression generation fought to build and the failure of the next generation to actually live inside it. There is something I want to say carefully here, because I think it is both important and easily misunderstood. The people who transmitted these habits to you were not wrong to have them. They were not financially ignorant or psychologically weak or making poor decisions given what they knew and what they had experienced. They were people who had been taught by one of the harshest teachers imaginable that specific behaviors were necessary for survival, and those behaviors were necessary, in their context, for their conditions. The transmission of those behaviors to the next generation was an act of love, of protection, of trying to prepare the people they cared about most for a world that had shown its capacity for catastrophic cruelty. The habits were a gift, a difficult, costly, hard-won gift from people who paid for them in genuine suffering. What you owe them, in return for that gift, is not the perpetuation of the fear that generated it. What you owe them is the use of the safety they built so that you would not have to live in fear the way they did, the safety they constructed through decades of frugality and sacrifice, and careful hoarding of whatever the world allowed them to keep, was built as a foundation, not as a ceiling. It was built so that you would not need the habits they needed, so that you could invest where they could only save, so that you could deploy where they could only protect, so that the generation born into the world their resilience made possible would be free to build in it, rather than merely survive it. The Depression ended, let some of its habits end too, not all of them, not the ones that carry genuine wisdom forward across different conditions, not the anti-consumerism, or the maintenance ethic, or the appreciation for what you have. Those are worth keeping. Those are the parts of the inheritance that make you better equipped than most of your contemporaries for the financial discipline that building wealth actually requires. But the parts that are fear rather than wisdom, the parts that are responses to a world that no longer exists rather than strategies for the world that does, those parts deserve to be examined, updated, and, where they are doing damage, released, with gratitude for the people who formed them, and with the clarity to understand that the best way to honor what they built through so much sacrifice is to actually live inside the safety they created for you, fully, without flinching, deploying what they protected, building on what they preserved, extending forward the financial foundation they spent their lives constructing precisely so that you would not have to live as they lived, so that the fear that was their constant companion would not have to be yours. They survived so you would not have to live.